All right. Welcome to another episode of Rocco's Basilisk. I'm Graham. This is Bobak. And here we go. So, why don't we start with the question of whether or not OpenAI is already part of Microsoft? What do you think?
They seem to own the majority of it, right?
51% or something secretly. I think it's like not even publicly known somehow.
Yeah, but
They have to
they've
report at some
put
point.
in. They were
10 billion.
previously, I think, the largest investor with $1 billion, and now with the additional 10, and I've heard it's at a valuation of 30 post money, so they got to be majority owner. But the question is, does that mean they are a Microsoft company in the sense
Well,
we
it's
mean?
definitely, it has in my opinion, I haven't found Microsoft-backed products to be my favorite, shall we say. And I have also found that if I were to sort GCP, AWS, and Azure in the order of my desire to work with them, I would not put Azure at the top.
No,
And
very few would
yeah.
the tech industry professionals we know.
Yeah. And OpenAI is running ChatGPT on Azure. And as we know, not only does it go down really often and is really hard to get use of, a lot of even teenagers know when are the good times to use ChatGPT. They've learned the patterns. And
Yeah, they learn very fast.
yeah, and this is not something that you could do for AWS. AWS is so solid, and the auto scaling, especially the serverless or even, tools that scale up numbers of Docker containers.
But I'm pretty
works
sure
really
that
well.
over time, I mean, even though AWS or Amazon was the trailblazer there in terms of that kind of services, I think with time that head start is going to matter less and less. And over time, and I don't know how much time, pretty much all of those services, including the mysterious Alibaba cloud that I actually don't know any company that's on that, although I know that companies are on it, so it's not that it's not used. But eventually, all of them are going to become pretty much comparable in terms of all of the important metrics. I'm pretty sure of that.
Oh, I bet they will. It'll be
But and I mean on Microsoft, the Azure thing, from my understanding, a large percentage, if not the majority percentage of that initial $1 billion investment of Microsoft in OpenAI was actually in compute credits on Azure. And I'm
okay.
pretty sure that's the
Yeah.
same with these 10 billion that they put in. I haven't really read the details.
They're
I
just
don't know if
letting
the
them
details
use.
are revealed.
That's actually a really positive, that's really good point. It may just be Azure credits. That's it. Interesting.
Yeah, I'm fairly sure. I mean, I've read that was the case with the initial $1 billion. I don't know how verified that is.
Huh.
I don't know if you can verify it.
Yeah.
Obviously, a lot of this stuff is kept secret, but that's gonna be. I mean, I know of other companies. I can't really mention them. They're companies of friends and people I know where they've gotten a big investment from either Google. I know another one who got a big investment, multi-million-dollar investment from Amazon, or I guess Amazon Ventures, where majority of the investment was actually compute credits.
Do you think that Microsoft wants to use something like ChatGPT to power Bing?
I'm positive.
I think so too.
Yeah. Sam Altman got that question like a couple of days
Oh,
ago
really? Okay.
at an event. I forgot what it was here in San Francisco.
Did you say yes?
Well, what he did is he paused and he looked at the interviewer. It was like just him and this, I guess, sort of famous lady that does tech interviews in the Valley, and they've known each other for many years. And he was like, basically saying, I'm paraphrasing, but saying that he was surprised, and he basically said, I'm surprised you, with the lengthy experience you have in the Valley, asks a question that I'm not going to answer, that I cannot answer. It's about the strategy of another company, and I'm not going to talk about or reveal or speculate about sort of their strategy. You will have to ask them. But he was more curious about why she asked that question, because I guess, I don't know, it seems like he lost a bit of respect for, or I don't know what it was. He was just very surprised and more interested and curious about her reason to ask a question that she knows it's not going to get an answer. Anyways, that was his reaction to it.
Yeah, I think what we all know is that the reason journalists ask that is because in the response, even if it's a non-response, we can often read an answer.
Yeah, probably. But I guess he wasn't expecting that from her. Let's put it that way. But no, I mean, it's obvious, right? And maybe that was also part of his surprise. Maybe he was between the lines trying to say, isn't that obvious? I can't talk about it, but it's also an obvious thing. Yeah, I mean, it's a no-brainer. Right?
The thing that's going to be painful to watch is it's as people become lazier, they're going to trust it more. Just like we've all learned to trust Wikipedia more than we should, right?
Or like we once learned to trust calculators, right?
Yep. You're right. Like we've all learned to trust calculators. And maybe it works most of the time, but if anyone gets the ability to change things just a little bit, that's almost the same power as George Orwell talked about. He who controls the past controls the present.
Right. I mean, yeah, it's important to remember that it's like any other technology, not perfect. It will never be perfect, and it will have its flaws. Ironically enough, I mentioned calculators, arithmetic operations, at least with GPT 3.5, the current in production, publicly available ChatGPT, can't do simple arithmetic operations. And it's because we both know why, because it's a language model, right? It's I think it's character or whatever, token based prediction.
6,000 tokens.
Yeah, just tries to predict the most likely next token based on, I think the memory is, 7,000 tokens or something.
6,000, I think. It's
6,000, yeah.
6,000 token window. It's the best autocomplete mankind has ever made.
Yeah, that's essentially what it is. And therefore, naturally, arithmetic operations are not going to be perfect.
Yeah.
Because that's not.
But it gets them right until it doesn't.
Right.
Yeah. And it reminds me of this old joke about this criminal who goes up onto the stand in court, and they ask him, do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? And he says, to a point. They're like, what point is that? The point where I start lying, of course.
Yeah.
So if you don't know where that point is, you can't trust anything.
Yeah, correct.
That's kind of what I see happening with ChatGPT. You can trust it until you can't, and you don't know where that point is unless you do the work yourself, in which case you might as well not even ask.
Right. But I mean, people are still gonna, just like with any other technology, they're gonna use it, and they're just gonna accept it will be built into all kinds of scenarios and cultural contexts and business models that this technology, like any other technology, like when people start to use electricity, they were, especially in the early days, it was built into their models or use case models or business models, if it was a commercial use, that you're going to have a power outage. And it was like, okay, it's fine, we'll live with it, it's not perfect. And of course, over time, it's gotten better in most countries, and more reliable. The surges that might destroy your devices that are running off of their electricity. There are less and less, but you sort of just accept it because the benefits or the upside is just so huge that
Yeah.
the few errors you get are totally acceptable and eventually negligible.
Yeah, that's a good
So,
point. I'm sure there's going to be some other use cases we haven't even thought of yet. It is going to make our lives easier.
absolutely,
But
100%.
we do have to learn how to take it with a grain of salt. And that may be the hardest part of all.
Yeah. I mean, and also we got to remember it's a technology at its most rapidly evolving phase, right? In the sort of hype curve of it.
Speaking of hype curve, they went to 1 million users from 0 in 5 days.
5 days, yeah. It's the fastest growth to 1 million users any application has ever seen.
Yeah. So I think that makes the case for other natural language understanding startups.
Right.
At least I'm crossing my fingers there. I hope on that.
It does, yeah. I mean, I also think obviously, you know, the other technology giants incumbents are not just gonna stand still. Obviously they're working on similar things or maybe even better things. So soon this head start will be the same as the head start we were talking about earlier that, say, Amazon had with cloud computing. It will matter less and less over time. And in fact, if there's going to be a single or a few single winners, eventually they might be completely different than OpenAI. However, having met, in fact, Sam Altman once, I was once part of a startup where we applied to Y Combinator, and one of the first early interviews on sites, he was part of the panel that sort of interviewed me and the two other co-founders. But anyways, not that matters. That was like a 20-minute meeting. But knowing about him and having read stuff written by him, having read about him, I would not bet against him. There's a lot of other much smarter, much more successful people than me in the Valley that say the same thing with even more confidence. So he might take OpenAI all the way, and with all the way I mean, you know, to be the next
Google,
or the next $1 trillion company. Well,
I hope one of the things he has cooking in the back is something with type 2 computation. So type 1 computation is neural nets, and it's always, for our listeners, it's always the same number of computational steps. No matter how complicated the input, it's always the same to get an output. Type 2 is the one where you have symbols, you do logic, and for complex queries, maybe you do more steps. For simple ones, maybe you do fewer steps. Now, currently ChatGPT is type 1 as far as I can tell. Now, if they
I would say all of the technologies, as far as I've read, that OpenAI has worked on, including the stuff behind DALL-E, the GANs there, it's all type 1.
But if they were to marry it with the type 2 system, I think that will be a game changer. And I think that this year could be the year when the type 1 and type 2 systems start to talk to each other more.
What are the most promising or well-established type 2 systems or architectures for AI out there?
Well, all the old stuff, everything before neural networks, everything that involved
symbolic.
Symbolics.
But exactly. But that's sort of my point. Aren't most of those, if not all, dead now? Dead in the sense that no one's working on them?
Yes, there's some exceptions. One exception is policy networks. You can think of a policy network kind of as a series of steps, right? Logical steps. And you could put in that any symbolic process you want. That's one place. Another place is some people are representing those calculations in a graph. graph neural networks could bring those two together.
Right.
And I heard as much in a couple of the conversations that were going on the floor of NeurIPS. So the machine learning street talk guys, they go there and the main guy just talks to a ton of people in the lobby. He just has conversation after conversation. And in some of
for the listeners, NeurIPS is like the top AI neural network machine intelligence conference in the world.
Yep.
It used to be called NIPS.
Yeah. So I heard a subtext in a few of those conversations where people were starting to talk about how do we have neural networks and type 2 computation come together. And when you think about it, the set of all possible symbolic programs and logic programs is an infinite set of programs. It is infinite, but we have had neural networks guide us through infinite spaces before, or semi-infinite, really large spaces like AlphaGo, for instance. And maybe that's one way. I think one of the most promising ways is Josh Tenenbaum at MIT. He came up with something called DreamCoder, which is a neural network that looks at some examples, learns to do it, and then has a state where it plays those examples again and again to itself in its own head, so to speak, like a dream state. And then some third state, which I forget what it is, but the system ends up describing things in some meta structure that it learns. And it can learn concepts like what's a spiral and what's a circle and what are straight lines. And then it can learn concepts in linguistics, I think, and it does something else in other domains. It's very interesting. DreamCoder, and I don't think it got enough play.
Yeah, I don't think I know of Josh Tenenbaum. I don't know DreamCoder. Go check it out.
Yeah,
but yeah, I mean, in a way, the era of symbolic computation, symbolic AI is over. It might see a rebirth, as you said, with modern neural network based AI starting to reach its limits and the constraints and limitations thereof being exposed more and more to a greater body of scientists and research. But the question is, is a revival of the symbolic based computation the direction they will choose as an alternative, or is it something completely different? Is it a third until now unknown paradigm that will be
probably unpopular? Because when neural networks became popular in 2012,
fair enough.
They had been invented in 1958. I think.
Very true.
So one of the
it was just a revival of something that had been around for decades.
And it turns out Jeffrey Hinton never stopped working on it.
Yeah, that's the kind of guy he is.
So
he goes deep in the rabbit holes and he goes long, very long.
So one of those rabbit holes, which is currently not popular, but I think has a chance of becoming one of those next big things. And there'll probably be a bunch of the next big things, but one of them might be neuromorphic hardware. Intel Luigi 2 is, to me, it seems fascinating. And there are things that it can do at very low wattage that nothing else can do.
Right. You're thinking actual robotic brains?
I think that something
that will be housed in an actual humanoid robot.
Well, I mean, you can do that too, but I don't think that's the main use for it. I think the main use for it is better machine learning. The algorithms that you would use are just completely different because you can't program it the way you program a normal computer. You have to think of it as you don't have data in a separate place.
Right.
There's a tiny little bit of data storage right next to every compute.
Right.
And you can do things in a non-clock-based way.
Right.
Where each little neuron, in a sense, or each little processor with its own little bit of memory can just be sitting there waiting for something to happen. And then there's an event that occurs that it is sensitive to, and then it can do something based on that event. And there's a lot of freedom in the ways you can program these things, and you can consider them to be virtual neurons.
Mm-hmm.
It's a completely different paradigm. And to me, it sounds one step more similar to actual neurons. And that in and of itself makes it interesting to me.
That's a good point.
Now, secondarily, there are some tailwinds that are supporting the whole chip industry in the US. We're trying to bring things back here, of course. And I think we reached peak globalization probably 2019. And ever since then, we're drawing back a little bit. And I think we all realize now that extreme globalization gives us the cheapest stuff. And that was nice.
Yeah.
But the downsides are too much. The not being able to have a robust supply chain is too much. Not having jobs here in America is too difficult. So there's from the security.
Is it though? Like if the added sort of growth, quality of life, welfare, and just general sort of increase of the middle class, that kind of cheap products and services leads to, enables such innovation as, say, OpenAI, ChatGPT, and
Oh yeah.
Fusion.
So maybe we would
Fusion, right? Fusion is another big thing we should talk about.
Yeah.
If that's what it leads to, then eventually what it's going to lead to as well is, of course, sure, jobs will be lost, but that's not because they're going abroad. It's because they're being taken by technology. And eventually that also will, in my opinion, inevitably lead to something like UBI.
You think so?
I think I very much so. I do. Yeah. And when that happens, like, does it really matter where it came from? Because in that case, like, well, just think about, I was just talking to my sister, and just in the past few weeks, I've talked to so many people. My sister's a lawyer, and I've talked to other people, like actual just programmers, other people who work with a lot of sort of text and communication. They're talking about an insane, just unprecedented productivity increase just thanks to this very simple yet still stupid GPT model. And I'm like, wow, if each of them are saving on average, say, an hour a day, that's what's that? That's like 10-15% productivity increase across like an industry or many industries.
Yeah.
That means it should, in the long run, lead to, not very long run, I'm talking about like 6 to 12 months, lead to an actual GDP increase.
It could be, yeah,
across the board.
Yeah.
And what that eventually will mean is, when it's that rapid, it in my opinion, it leads to, it's almost inevitable for politicians to look at that and be like, oh no, we're just gonna put that money somewhere else. No, it's suddenly this extra money, and if, it's so easy for them to literally buy votes by saying, I'm going to be the first one to approve universal basic income, because it's for free, right?
Yeah.
So I actually believe that it is going to accelerate that, just on the sheer sort of productivity increase of industries and eventually nations.
I doubt it yet. I don't think we're ready for it yet for a couple of reasons. One is we probably could spend $10 trillion on better infrastructure, better schools, higher paid teachers, better hospitals, and still not have the job done.
Agreed.
So maybe we'll spend this money right. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right that there's other places it can be spent, but I mean, there's already available money in many countries, not the least America, to spend on those things. And what are we doing instead? We're spending it on military budget. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's different countries will probably choose to do different things with it, but I don't know. I'm hopeful that in America the benefits of a UBI will be seen broader, as a broader thing than just, winning political brownie points.
Let's talk about that military budget since you brought it up. Let's talk about specifically in the context of current events. I mean, Russia, Ukraine, that already kicked off. What's to stop China from trying to take Taiwan? Do you think they'll take it? Do you think they'll try in the next, let's say,
I mean, it would be
5
it would
years?
be the perfect timing for them. Maybe well, I could argue that maybe they've even missed their perfect window, unless they know something about Putin's plans that we don't know, meaning they know something about a major escalation about to come, meaning Putin goes from, the partial mobilization he announced, that like 7 months ago, to, or less, 6 months ago, to a full mobilization. Which means, I don't know how big the Russian army is.
He probably has 6 million people in the entire country that he could somehow possibly legally send there. And he'd have to just do it by force, and those people don't want to go. And they won't do well while they're there. But the fact that there's so many of them will make a big difference on the ground.
Oh, 100%. So if he does that, then I think might be the perfect, in the midst of all that, it would be the perfect sort of distraction for China to actually make a move on Taiwan.
It's a nice big distraction. Yeah. It's also,
Sorry, I just realized I'm giving my former company, because we were acquired, so free advertisement here, without intention. That was completely.
They didn't sponsor us. I thought they sponsored us.
No, they have not sponsored us. I'm gonna do this instead.
So it's a very sad sunset maneuver, I think, for Russia to do this. If Russia did not have this war, they already don't have enough young people to really have a strong, full next population. Their demographics are very top heavy. A lot of older people, not enough young people, definitely not enough engineers because they've had such a brain drain. I mean, there are extreme things like they have a lot of their oil wells in tundra, in permafrost. And in 1991 or so, when everything started to collapse, they shut some of them off. And there's water in the mixture as well. So if you shut it off, the water ends up freezing, breaks the pipes, you have to drill it again. with the help
Yeah.
of Western companies like BP and Shell, whatever that came in, they were able to get back to capacity by 2020. That's how long it took. Yeah, 30 years.
Yeah.
So now, without those, all those professionals, they all left the country, and many of Russia's top professionals have left the country. That one of those things aren't coming back. Russia's never going to be what it was before. Now, they kind of had a chance to be a good part of the global community. They had a good reputation for smart people and some good technology. They had
They
resources.
still do, right?
Yep.
I mean, the reputation didn't go away. It's just the collaborations and
the people went away.
Yeah, exactly.
The Russians are still smart. They're just not in Russia anymore.
They're not in Russia. Yeah.
At least a lot of them. So Russia as an economy is really on this downward cycle because they didn't have enough young people and they weren't having enough kids to have a strong next generation.
Yeah.
And now, a bunch of them are going to die in war.
Yeah.
So these very people that you would need to build the country of the future are all dying in war. And there's, in my mind, there's two possibilities that help me understand this. And I don't know which one's right, but they both lead to the same actions. One of them, Bill Browder, the former head of Hermitage Capital, who was personally in all those legal battles with Putin, and one of his lawyers was killed in Russian prison, and it was Magnitsky. And the Magnitsky Act is named after him, and he's the reason why we can do these sanctions. He started that legal process under Obama. Anyway, he says that all of this is a diversion. When you and a few of your cronies steal $1.6 trillion from the people you're supposed to be governing, other people get upset after a while. And you have to do more and more drastic things to, distract them. And starting wars is one of the best. I mean, he did, this is his second Ukrainian war. He also did Moldova and, Georgia and some other place, I forget. Oh, Syria and Chechnya.
Yeah.
So it's just a distraction to keep people not looking at the fact that you're stealing from them. And you're throwing tons of them in jail and just ruining the future of Russia. So that's one theory. The other theory comes from long-term Russian and Soviet thinking, and actually pre-Soviet. If you look at Russia's landmass, there's only a small habitable zone that's sort of habitable. It's not quite as dense as Nebraska. I mean, that's what we're talking about. And if you go north of that, it's too cold. If you go south of that, it's desert. So there's not enough economic activity to support a good highway system. So rail is all they really can support. So if you're going to protect that landmass, it's actually incredibly hard. And if you've ever played Risk, you remember how hard it is. And for probably thousands of years, whoever lived there was attacked by people who did not live there because it's just flat plains. You just come on in. Now, during the height of the Soviet Union, they changed that situation for the first time ever. They were able to expand up to the mountain ranges. And then they could forward position a few troops at each gap in the mountain ranges. And that's the only time they were actually safe in their mind. So the thing is that he wants that back. And every one of the little actions that they took over the last 10 years has been toward that. Nagorno Karabakh, South Ossetia, Ukraine, Crimea, all these things are trying to expand to those mountain ranges. There's 9 gaps that they have to expand up into. And if they get Ukraine, they get 2 more of them. They'll be a little bit closer. They have like 2 now, 2 or 3. But the problem is there's no scenario in which the world is going to let them, because they would have to take back, Hungary, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova. They have to subjugate and deny rights to all those people in order to feel safe.
Right.
So I don't see that happening either. And I don't know what's going on in Putin's mind. Is it just the distraction from the stealing, or is it this long-term, military strategy thinking? They both lead to the same actions.
Yeah, I mean, why can't it be both?
Maybe.
Or is there a third reason?
Yeah, or some third thing we haven't thought of.
I mean, I'm sure it has been thought of by others. We just haven't. Like, for instance, this famous political history professor at University of Chicago, John Mersheimer.
Yep, I listened to him.
A couple of videos of his on Facebook, where he talks about obviously just generally Soviet-US relationships over the course of the past 100 years, and even prior to that, he is obviously very well read and educated on the topic. He's written books and lots of political science papers on it, and then he focuses on, of course, the last two wars, meaning the Crimea one and this one, and views it sort of being very well read on sort of Russian mentality when it comes to these things. He kind of presents the Russian perspective on it, and basically talks about Russia versus NATO type of balance. That's what is, if there's anything Russia fears about the West, it's not even America, it's NATO. They might even be so crazy as thinking they can win a war against America, but they're not as crazy as to think that they're going to win a war against NATO. That's basically so the gist of him presenting the Russian mentality in terms of the basics, which is fear, power, and the balance of political balance of the regions in Eastern Europe and some parts of former Soviet Union, like Georgia and a few other states like Chechnya. And basically he's saying that if you view it from the lens of these sort of almost Pavlovian needs of like fear and safety and power, the actions that the US, well, NATO had under the former and more current, former as in like way back during the first 2009, the first Georgian war, and then a few years later the first Crimean or Ukrainian war in Crimea. It was all basically provocations that we in the West, either knowingly or unknowingly, depending on how, if you view it from the nation's perspective or if you view it from the NATO general's perspective, basically a provocation that we caused. Again, he's an American, John Mersheimer, and certainly not a Russia supporter or ally, but as an academic, he's really trying hard to sort of try a steel man argument than a straw man, and I mean he makes a convincing case in terms of like viewing it from the NATO provocation angle, and how the balance there in that region, especially Eastern Europe, ever since the fall of the wall, is a very delicate one that you can't just mess around with. You got to handle it. You got to have the smartest brains, political brains of both sides managing that balance. Otherwise, situations like this will occur. I'm dumbing it down because I'm dumb, simplifying it, but that's sort of the gist of it. And as I see it, that's maybe a third perspective. They all lead to the same, as you said, the same end result. But I think maybe knowing how we ended up where we are, like the causes, the underlying causes, might help in helping us out of it. Because I guess none of us on either side or any side want this to be escalated further.
So if we dumb it down even further, let's pretend we're kids on a playground. And Russia is like that pretty big kid who's beating up a smaller kid. You know?
Well, again, no, I don't. Maybe it's too dumbed down, or maybe it's not dumbed down enough, because yes, you may say that, but Russia might say that no, we're sort of the quiet kid that you don't want to anger because he's a whatever emo. You don't want to anger him because he might turn out to be a crazy guy, and you don't want to mess with the crazy guy. Leave him alone. Leave him with this, Moscow University physics and math books, because he's that kind of nerd. And yeah, don't provoke him. And it's America that's, or NATO in America, whatever, that's the bully, and they're manipulating this other kid to basically, by proxy, provoke the emo kid. And then of course they're gonna keep pushing this other kid, to the proxy kid, to keep provoking or just keep fighting, and they'll cheer him on, but they're not gonna get involved themselves until the emo kid does something stupid, and then the big kid that's much bigger than the emo kid is gonna come in and just smack the shit out of the emo kid. But the big kid is just waiting there for his excuse to do it, and they're trying to get to the excuse by keep pushing the proxy kid, who's just little and stupid and doesn't understand. Again, this is sort of just the same dumbed down scenario you explained, but from the devil's advocate, literally.
So
Putin is the devil.
At the end of that speech that Mearsheimer gave, the one that went viral, he has this one little throwaway comment that I wonder if other people heard this and took it to heart. Someone said, well, what if he does invade Ukraine? And Mearsheimer says, well, that would be like trying to swallow a porcupine. Yeah, if you really want to ruin Putin, convince him to try to take Ukraine.
Yeah, and that's exactly. Yeah, I remember that comment. Yeah, that's what Putin is doing now. So yeah, you could even argue that the scenario described, it's actually whatever, the big fat NATO kid, or maybe someone even behind him who's sort of whispering things, that has convinced both these kids to, the porcupine to sort of go towards the emo kid, and the emo kid and on the other side sort of convince the emo kid to try to eat the porcupine.
Yeah, so I don't think there's any way to look at Ukraine and see that story. Here's why. So now that I've made some Ukrainian friends and I've gotten to learn more about the story, like you said earlier, it's good to understand how we got here. So let's take that a little further back, or a lot further back. In the year whatever 800 or something, people founded Kiev. And then they became a people, and they had language and a culture and all that. it wouldn't be another 300 years before Moscow was founded. Now, nowadays, Putin likes to tell the story that they're the real center of the people, and Ukraine is just one of them. It's a satellite of their culture, instead of the other way
Right.
around. When the Soviet Union started, they said to Ukraine, you're going to be a part of this. And they said, no, we're not. They said, yes, you are. No, we're not. And then this war started. And turns out the Ukrainians lost. The Russians won. They dominated Ukraine. There was an insurgency for quite a while. A guy named Bandera, I guess was his name. He led the insurgency, and the insurgency just wouldn't stop. So the Russians were like, okay, we're going to starve you to death. And they starved 6 million of them to death during the 1920s, when we were all having a great time. And we didn't have internet or Twitter, so we didn't really know or care over here. But they had another Holocaust, in a sense. 6 million Ukrainians starved to death because they had food. Sure, it was made in their country, the wheat in their country, but it was all shipped back to Moscow.
Yeah.
They forcibly starved them to death, so much so they needed people to replace the ones they had just starved to death. So they moved a bunch of people from Moscow down. And then people talked about, oh, but part of Ukraine was always pro-Russia, and they were Russian speaking. Well, after you starve them to death and replace them with Russian families, I can see how that might happen.
Yeah.
But even them, after the February 24th began, even the previously pro-Russian ones are no longer pro-Russian.
Right.
I mean, it has been a huge, huge difference. Now,
Yeah.
if you watch the Netflix documentary Winter on Fire, it's all about the protests that were going on in Kyiv during 2014. And if you watch it, it's amazing. It's like watching Les Mis, but the protesters win at the end. It is unbelievable. Basically, Russia knew that Ukraine had decided after the fall of the Soviet Union to become its own state, to get independence. So Russia found another way to control it. And they were able to use, bribes and a lot of people that were still in power in certain offices to get one of their pro-Russian candidates into power.
Right.
And he did not have Ukraine's best, desires at heart. And Ukraine was voting to say, we want to be part of the European Union. We want to be connected to the West. And he was saying, oh, yeah, we'll probably do that. We'll probably do that. And at the last minute, he signed something with Putin and said, oh, we're going to do this instead. And the people protested so much all winter long in the super bitter, cold Ukrainian winter and the president was sending out their secret police, whatever they're called, to, shoot at protesters sometimes, beat them up a lot. But the protesters just would not stop. And this is 2014. I didn't even hear about it except for maybe a few bylines on the news. But really an amazing documentary. And then eventually the president, he got scared for his life. And where'd he go? Went back to Moscow. Now, recently, in the recent war, supposedly he was brought almost to the border. They were when the war started again, the February 24th conflict started, I think there was talk of putting him back into power. There's even documents that really revealed the Russians thought they were going to take all of Ukraine in 3 days. They were very optimistic. But yeah, so the Ukrainians, despite not having the democratic legal means to get freedom and democracy, they got it.
Yeah.
And now they're holding on to it tooth and nail with everything they have. Now, the scary thing for the West, in my opinion, was also the surprisingly good thing for the West. They realized that Russia can't fight modern warfare. Even Ukraine could hold them off. And so once we saw that, we're like, that's good and bad. That means if Russia ever goes into direct conflict with NATO, Russia loses really quick, and they know that, which means they're going to want to go nuclear.
Yeah.
So the best thing we can all do is never get to that.
Yeah.
Which means
and I think that's
all
a very important
It's got to start
conclusion of
and end here.
yeah. I think that's a very important conclusion to draw from all this, that Russia is probably, if push comes to shove, they are prepared to go nuclear, and we shouldn't be. Like,
Yeah. I think I'm not super scared for a couple of reasons. I have a couple of friends who are involved in the military industrial complex, and I have some vague notion that among the 3 different levels of anti-missile technology we have in this country and over parts of Europe, that even during an all-out nuclear attack, Russia's nuclear missiles aren't actually going to work as advertised, and we'll probably be okay. If our systems fail, we might lose the city. One, that's the kind of
I'm
idea.
not sure that's a risk worth taking, but
It's not a risk.
maybe
worth
you're
taking.
right, but there's a chance that there's a non-zero chance, right?
Yep. It's not a risk worth taking. I don't want to take it. I think we all realize this fight that's going on in the playground, we got to keep it on the playground.
Yeah, or we got to stop it.
Yeah, but stopping it it's weird, because I do believe Putin's playing from a fundamentally different playbook than it's hard for us even to imagine. Like, for instance, when he took Georgia, we thought that not being an aggressor to force in and go back and do a Gulf War I, like Saddam takes Kuwait, we all went in and forced him to give back Kuwait. And then we left him alone, whatever. We thought that, well, instead of doing that with Putin, he took Georgia. Okay, let's kind of like just be hands off and let him keep that part of Georgia. Moldova, Transnistria, let's let him keep it. We thought that being non-aggressive was going to be the right choice. But then he did it again, and he did it again. And I really believe from these actions, what I've seen is that when we don't stand up to him, instead of him feeling secure and feeling okay, he feels like he can do more.
Right. I mean,
staying where he was.
I don't think Putin is a madman. I think he's probably done some miscalculation in this case. I do think he's evil. I think most Russians believe he's evil. Most educated or sort of modern new generation Russians think he's evil, a bad person. But I think it would be foolish to think that that he's unintelligent, or B, that he's a madman. And with those two sort of assumptions or potentially facts established, I think we have to also realize that therefore he's probably not going to choose to act irrationally. He will choose to act evil when he can, under the sort of assumptions of rationality. There's nothing that says that evil and rationality are not compatible. But I don't, again, him not being a madman, I don't think he's going to throw rationality out of the window. He will continue to act evil as long as he can do it rationally. He's not going to do it as a madman, because he knows that's going to jeopardize his position. That's number one. And B, his country's position. So again, given all of those assumptions and presuppositions, one has to look at, again, his reasons for wanting to invade or go to war against Georgia. Now, remember, Georgia is still sort of an independent country. None of it has been annexed. In this,
some of it has. South Ossetia has.
Yeah, but that was something that was, according to what I've read, and again, I'm not an expert on any of these things, something that was actually happening before the war. Like there was separatists there that had started some conflict that apparently for a long time Putin just ignored. But and then and then of course with Ukraine and Crimea, that was the first time he actually took such an action. So at the sort of cost that it caused him then, because that was the first wave of sanctions, and now the second one that's certainly to some extent devastating his country financially, and the major brain drain that they're experiencing. One has to ask, like, if he's not doing this because he's a madman, then why is he doing this? And it would have to be a rational reason. It would have to be a reason that can be motivated. Like the risk benefit trade-off has to make sense in any sort of framework of rationality. Now, granted, the Russian mentality and thinking is different, but logic and rationality is kind of universal throughout the universe. So the equations have to make sense. Now, what you choose to put on the different sides of the equation, equal sign, is going to be different in different cultures because you're going to value different things. But in the end, the sum has to, of course, balance because the equation has to make sense. So the question is, what is it that he puts on the different sides of this scale and says, okay, this is worth this. This is worth this much pain or this much cost, this much suffering, this much death, and this much, internal conflict as well for me. And yeah, so I think that's an important question to ask. It's of course very evident to all of us what he did in Georgia, what he did in Chechnya, what he is doing in Ukraine.
Yep, what he did in Moldova.
Or Moldova.
Yeah.
So we have to sort of ask, why is he doing it? Yeah, I think that why is very important.
Yep. And
that's going to be the way we can de-risk, I think.
But
that knowledge is going to help us de-risk the fear of a nuclear escalation. Although, as I agree with you, it's probably very, very small. As long as it's not zero, I don't want to take the gamble. So yeah, okay, he's acting like a clear bully. But like we need to understand why he's doing it. Because then this is the stupid thing about nuclear weapons, right? Once we put this monster in the world, and it's out there now in the thousands, tens of thousands of these little monsters that can destroy all of us. We've created a world where we can't just muscle the bully. We especially when some of these bullies on the playground actually have this monster weapon. It's like the dragons in Game of Thrones.
Yep.
Once they exist, no matter how, in your opinion, crazy, bullyish, or whatever the opposite side is acting, you just got to treat them differently now because they have a dragon.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think in Game of Thrones, the dragons represent nuclear weapons.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's my theory. And I haven't even watched Game of Thrones. I just watched the sequel, which is a prequel, supposedly. The House of...
Yep. House of Dragons, baby.
House of Dragons. Sorry. Yes, that's what it's called. House of Dragons. Yeah, so that's when I started developing this theory that, okay, this is all about nations and powers and certain powers that have dragons.
Yeah, if it were written in the 1940s, it'd be about air power, air superiority. Yeah.
Right.
Well, let's bring this back to China for a second. And nuclear still.
So if China knows that Putin is gonna escalate this, I'm not saying escalate it to nuclear, but escalate this to a much even severe level than it is now, then they're probably waiting for that. And that would be in the past 20 and in the next 20 years, I'm guessing that would be the best window for them. If they don't do it then they probably won't do it later either.
They might have only 600 million people by 2050. because they've overcounted a lot, and they are losing a lot of people to COVID. They finally opened things up, and it turns out their vaccine doesn't work, and
Right.
a lot of people are dying right now. So here's one thing about Taiwan. When you think about the logistics, it's going to be much harder for China to attack Taiwan than it was for Russia to attack Ukraine. Think about this. Ukraine was not ready. They didn't really have a good army. They didn't have much of an air force. They were still dealing with a lot of pro-Russians in their organizations that were just adding a lot of corruption to the mix. Also, for the first time ever, they were going to develop a 3,000-mile long-range missile. And it was going to go into production. I heard it was called the Neptune, and it was going to go into production April. So that's another reason why they had to come in before then. So February, just a couple months before April. Now, Taiwan's different. Taiwan, they've been preparing for invasion since 1954. And during that time, their economy has grown by leaps and bounds. They have courted the favor of the entire world by building technology for us. They did something different than was done by Japan. In Japan, of course, they became a very technologically advanced nation, but they tried to compete directly with US chip makers. And we worked hard to fight against that. TSMC had a slightly different strategy. Well, we're not going to design the chip. We're just going to make the fab for you. So we'll buy the ASML machines from the Netherlands, install them here, and we will run a clean room with employees that are fully well trained. And that clean room is super expensive. I mean, it's amazing how clean that whole situation is. And they started doing a business for us that we didn't really want to do. It wasn't the creative part of the business. And in effect, you fast forward a few years, now all the top chips, most of them are made there. Now, interestingly, in China, there are very few chips that are actually made. They're all the low-end chips, like the chip that runs a coffee maker or a fridge. But the chips that are in your car are probably not made in China. They're made somewhere else, like perhaps Japan, South Korea, or Taiwan, or even here. So Taiwan has become essential to the world. And then recently, Biden signed the CHIPS Act, I guess it was called, and he signed either as that or an executive order that made it illegal to sell mid and high level chips into China, and illegal to sell the machinery to make those into China. And this is like saying to all of China, you're stuck here, 2023 level. You're not going to go advance any further in technology. China has been trying to make their own chips for decades, and they keep failing. This is not something they'll catch up to anytime soon. If they want to catch up to where we are right now in 2023, it might take them until 2033. So they're going to find some way around this. Is that going to be buying chips on the black market, or is that going to be attacking Taiwan? I don't know. But there's more than one reason for them to attack Taiwan. It's not just personal, pride of the country, although that's enough of a reason. Xi Jinping has made it his, number one thing. We got to take back Taiwan. And he's consolidated power. He has a bunch of yes men around him. And he has more power than Mao Zedong had. In some sense, he may be, the most powerful person in history because of all the people in China. But in some other sense, not, because he's been getting such little information. Usually, your power is also dependent on your ability to make good decisions, or your decision-making ability.
Yeah.
He's not getting the input. When they were having blackouts about a year ago or so, huge blackouts across the country in different parts that were even, delaying iPhone shipments and whatnot. It seems like he didn't know about it for months, like 5 months. In fact, when he learned about it was when Biden brought it up in a conversation. He probably didn't know about it until that conversation. None of his people would tell him because it's bad news. And
Right.
it's, as a decision-making organization, the Chinese Communist Party is doing about as bad a job as anybody could do. It'd be hard to do a worse job, which scares me because he may be equally uninformed about the ability of his own armed forces. Like when Russia positioned their forces around Ukraine, everyone thought he's just bluffing because he doesn't have enough to attack the country. Well, he didn't have enough to attack the country, but he also wasn't bluffing because in his mind, he thought it was enough. And maybe the guys working for him told him it was enough, but they definitely didn't tell him that 70% of the money meant to maintain the equipment actually ended up in Swiss bank accounts. A lot of the soldiers who were on staff didn't exist. Their salaries were going to bank accounts somewhere. And there's just corruption at every level, making the whole system not able to actually execute on a war. And Putin didn't know that. He would have calculated that if he had. I bet Xi Jinping may be dealing with something like that too, and he doesn't know, and we won't know until it gets tested. Now,
Right.
if they start to build up forces, and it looks like they're going to do a D-Day invasion of Taiwan, Taiwan has plenty of nuclear reactors, and they have the technological know-how to make nuclear weapons. They will have time. So if China wants to take Taiwan without Taiwan having enough time to do that, they have to go in a radical, like, we're going to get every boat that exists in the economy and just all attack at once. And they will probably be able to take Taiwan if they do something like that, if we don't help. So if we don't help, if South Korea doesn't help, and if Japan doesn't help.
Yeah, but if we're busy with almost Third World War on our hands in Eastern Europe, then yeah,
then it'd be up to Japan and Korea and Australia. And Japan and Korea and Australia all care what happens.
Yeah, but
so
they can't. They can't put, like, everyone knows there's only one military power that can offer reasonable resistance against a Chinese invasion of Taiwan.
I disagree. Okay. Here's why. So there have been a number of war games. They play these war games out.
Yeah.
And if the US doesn't help, and Australia doesn't help, and New Zealand doesn't help, and Korea doesn't help, and Japan doesn't help, if it's truly Taiwan totally on its own, the Chinese might be able to take it if they do a really quick mad dash, don't let Taiwan know about it or prepare, and they're willing to lose at least 500 million people. Now, once they get Taiwan, it will be pretty much destroyed, and there will be nothing there that's worth having. The chip market.
Why would that be the case, though?
The chip market, the chips are the technology of the future. That's what they'd be getting it for. But they would have to bomb Taiwan so heavily, all of that would be destroyed.
Why would they have to bomb Taiwan?
If they wanted to take Taiwan.
Why would they need to bomb it so heavily in order to take it?
They will not be able to just go there with their boats and say, please give us Taiwan. Taiwan will be launched.
No, but you're putting up two extremes. Like, one is just asking nicely, and the other one is just destroying the entire island and just bombing it, every square inch of it. But there's an in between, right? Where you bomb just enough to get them to capitulate and be like, okay, we'd rather live than die.
I don't think that Taiwan feels.
Isn't that the whole point of sort of wars? Because if everyone knew that every war ends with you've destroyed what you wanted to get, then no one would go to war. The whole point of wars is that that there's a sweet spot somewhere between lose, everyone loses, and the point where you don't get what you want, where someone gets what they want and the other one loses. That's why people go to war, because they know that there's going to be a winner and a loser.
Well, let's play that out.
I mean, philosophically, everyone loses at wars, but
let's play that out a little bit.
Materialistically, wars usually end with one side losing and the other side winning.
Let's play that out a little bit. Let's say that they come to Taiwan and they're able to somehow take Taiwan without destroying the buildings that make the chips. You know, the TMC.
No, they'll destroy a third of the buildings that make the chips.
Okay, so let's say they destroyed a third.
Like, I mean, the point is, I can always make up a case, because again, we're just sort of hypothesizing. I can always make up a case where they've destroyed enough to get Taiwan to, just basically give up, because they have nothing to put up as resistance. They can't withstand the greater power, the greater army. All right, so they give up, and a significant portion still maintainable or survivable or salvageable of the very important Taiwanese infrastructure, not to mention the strategic sort of position of Taiwan is there, and it's a win for China.
Let's talk about that scenario.
Yeah.
Remember that Taiwan has a very good air force. Let's pretend again the fiction that the US, Korea, Japan, and Australia, New Zealand will not come to their defenses. Let's pretend that. China comes over. Some projections are they will lose upwards of 500 million people and many of their naval vessels. If they're to overcome the Taiwanese Air Force, that involves lots of bombing, lots of missiles. And then you've got to maintain control. And the RAND Corporation says that if you have, a well-disciplined organization like the US Army, and you have a population that doesn't really want you there, then a 40-to-1 ratio will be necessary, best case scenario, to maintain relative peace.
Right.
So they have like 23 million people in Taiwan. So after losing 500 million Chinese to take it, they will have to have.
I don't quite understand why they would have to lose 500 million to take it.
Some military analysts I read somewhere looked at that. That was just a number abroad. Obviously,
that sounds 2 orders of magnitude larger than what I would expect.
It does sound like a lot. It does. I don't know.
I'm just flagging that I'm very skeptical to that. I would need to see the analysis to be able to agree to it. Unless it's just a hypothetical. I mean, but we can.
Yeah. Again, just a hypothetical. Getting a million people to Taiwan from China during that to control it will still leave a lot of the population wanting to do something back. And they may likely destroy whatever capacity to make chips was already there. They may sabotage it. It's not going to be a win in any way, except politically, they're going to be able to say we took back Taiwan.
Right.
For instance, Hong Kong was valuable because they had banking that the rest of the world trusted. Commercial centers, the rest of the world trusted. The rest of the world no longer can trust that China is going to be hands off and let rule of law lead the way in Hong Kong. So China kind of did the golden goose thing.
Yeah.
But they do now control Hong Kong, and it is no longer free. And they want to do the same thing to Taiwan. It's not theoretical, and everyone in Taiwan sees this. And
no, I don't. That's not what I meant with theoretical.
Yeah.
I meant the number. Otherwise, I think it's very a real threat that China will attempt to take Taiwan.
Yeah, and I believe that the only thing that would keep China from taking it is if they understood realistically that the cost was higher than they were willing to pay.
And that's what I meant with my scenario, that they have to be decentivized so much that they won't even think of attempting it. And the only way that would happen is with a extremely strong US military presence in the what's it called, the South China Sea.
I think that we need to stay a little further away. Here's why. There is some indication that China would be able to take out 2 aircraft carriers.
Yeah, I don't doubt that
Yeah.
either. Yeah.
So
No, I think that needs to be managed very carefully. I agree.
Yeah.
It's the same as with the Russia-Ukraine situation. We don't want to provoke it. Like, I mean,
yeah,
that would be the worst thing. Like if we realized that, oh, it didn't need to happen, or China was kind of on the fence about this. They were thinking about it. There were internal struggles, internal disagreements at the highest level under Xi Jinping, that should we do it, should we not do it, disagreements. And then served on a silver platter, the side that actually was internally within China pushing for invading Taiwan suddenly got the best argument. Look what US is doing. They moved their
aircraft carriers to the South
aircraft
China Sea.
carriers right next to Taiwan. They are provoking us, and it would be weakness at this point if we listen to these weaklings on the opposing side here in China, that we shouldn't invade Taiwan. We have to do it now. And
You're
then
right.
it's like, oh
Yeah.
shit, we caused
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Right. Because
yeah.
I bet there is that kind of internal struggle going in. I don't think China is just like Russia. There might be one guy at the top that we only see and we think he rules everything with an iron fist, and there's no opposition. It's all everyone's, Borg. We are Borg mind, but that's not the case. These are humans too. Meaning, in a country that big, there's definitely going to be factions and opposing sides and different political sides. So yeah, I think best thing to do is actually to try to empower the side in these countries that agrees with us, rather than just fighting and forcing the country to unite against us. Just keep the divide in that country. Make the side that is opposing, the dictatorship stronger.
Yeah. Or another thing we could do is just support all other Southeast Asian partners.
Or that, yeah.
Let Vietnam be stronger economically and militarily, and maybe they will take a little bit more of their international waters.
Precisely, yeah. I think that's the more cautious, more mature, more long-term way of creating stability in that region.
Okay. You want to talk about reality?
I would love to, but I gotta go in 10 minutes. Reality seems like a more than a 10-minute topic.
It is. Okay. Well, we'll talk about it next time.
Yeah, because I still gotta watch. I've watched one of the things you sent me. I gotta watch the other one. There's a lot there.
There is. So that'll be next time. Reality.
Yeah, reality. Well, we've talked about a different kind of reality this time. What is it called? The tangible political reality. And societal reality in terms of like ChatGPT. Next time we'll talk about the philosophical reality, which might be even more real than our reality.
Yes. All right. Signing off. Awesome. Another episode of Roko's Basilisk.